Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this series of videos, I'm here to give you as much practical advice as I can about world building. In a previous episode, I went over some pointers on how you can weave descriptions of your world into your narrative in a way that feels organic and unintrusive, and in these following videos, I'll be focusing more on the behind-the-scenes process of conceptualizing and developing your world on its own. I'll be doing this mostly in the context of fantasy because that's my main genre, but as I've said before, world building is by no means limited to speculative fiction. It is just as relevant for historical or even contemporary because regardless of where or when your story is set, it will still be about people and places with their own past and their own web of relationships, all of which provides valuable context that deepens your reader's appreciation for the story. Now, as with most things in writing, world building is very subjective and appeals to different people for different reasons, but generally, your two main angles of attack will be world first or story first. And in this video, those are the two concepts I'll be honing in on. So with that in mind, let's get into it. In the world-first approach, as the term implies, you begin by sitting down and making a dedicated effort to build up your world essentially from scratch, more or less. Geography, countries, cultures, political relations, histories, that kind of thing. In the most extreme cases, you'll be doing this before you have any kind of specific story idea in mind, instead relying on the details of the world to inspire you. This is more or less the same process as the one behind tie-in novels to games like Dungeons & Dragons, World of Darkness, or Magic the Gathering, only in your case, you're leaving out the game part. Now, within the realm of World First, there is a spectrum of subcategories that span from what I call systemic to atmospheric world building. Systemic world building is a very grounded and down-to-earth approach that is mainly concerned with systems, the distribution of natural resources, the economies that are built on those resources, and the societal developments that emerge from those economies, all with the purpose of creating a world that is not realistic in a physical sense, but plausible as a place where societies can develop and thrive. Perhaps the most well-known example of this today is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, which allegedly was born after he read The Lord of the Rings and thought to himself, well, that's very nice, but what is Aragorn's tax policy? On the other end of the spectrum, atmospheric world building is all about vibes. These worlds tend to be a lot more fanciful and a lot more out there, such as the planes of Magic the Gathering, which very often take a single idea and then extrapolate it to a degree that pushes the bounds of imagination. Because of this natural lean toward exaggeration, atmospheric worlds lend themselves pretty easily to sweeping epics, but this is by no means a must. They can just as well be confined to a single city or even a single building like Duskmourn, because what ultimately sets these apart is that they're less concerned with practical reality and more with the idea of, hey, wouldn't this be interesting? Now, I do want to emphasize that while these are the two polar opposites, there is a full spectrum between them. The World of Darkness, for example, starts with the vibe of, hey, what if vampires were real? And then uses that to build a more or less convincing alternate reality where all manner of creatures of darkness live amongst us in society. If you choose to go with the world first route, there's a couple of tips I can give you. The first one is a major caveat, which I have also mentioned in the previous video, namely that the more effort you put into developing your world, the more you run the risk of becoming infatuated with it to the point where you kind of forget to tell the story and just bombard your reader with all manner of info dumps because look at all these cool details I came up with. So the main thing I would recommend here is to exercise restraint and always remind yourself that the world building should serve the story, not the other way around. A good story can always get by on mediocre world building, but a mediocre story needs exponentially better world building to hit the same mark. The second pitfall is about flexibility, or rather the lack thereof. The more things you set in stone about your world, the more likely you can end up in a situation where your story would really benefit from something happening in the past, but the canonical history of your world makes that impossible. And in that case, you'll have to make a choice between changing your story or changing your world. And the third one is something I noticed a couple of times with writers who specifically lean into systemic world building, where their worlds are technically very realistic, and yet they feel, for lack of a better word, sterile. Because these writers became overly focused on nitty-gritty details like grain distribution and trade routes and resource conflicts, and in the process they kind of forgot that humans make irrational decisions all the time, and some of those humans are in charge of running countries. Yes, the majority of wars are fought over resources, but there have been and continue to be just as many wars started for completely nonsensical reasons. So while I do understand the satisfaction of figuring out the clockwork of socioeconomic forces, if you really want your world to come alive, don't forget to add a little bit of human chaos. So, besides world first, your other main direction will be the story first approach, which is where you begin by creating characters, conflicts, themes, and plot points, and then you fabricate a world that can house all of these. There are any number of reasons why this might be an appealing choice. The first and most prosaic one is when the world is just not terribly important to the story. If your novel is set in a standard fantasy world modeled after late medieval or early modern Europe, then there's a lot of common historical knowledge that you can fall back on. Your readers will know what lords, knights, and serfs are. They will assume the existence of feudalism, some kind of state church, as well as a host of societal conventions like monogamy, heteronormativity, male primogeniture, and so on. A great example of this is Jill Barup's Just Stab Me Now, which, if you didn't know, started out as a series of semi-improvisational YouTube sketches before eventually growing into its own story that is very character-focused, and the world is basically just there to be set dressing. Another, more artistic reason why you might go story first is for tonal consistency. If your story has very pronounced and distinct emotional themes like coping with loss and grief, then you can make your entire world a metaphor for that and shape each aspect of it that the characters encounter so that they resonate or contrast with the character's emotional journey. Alternatively, you might want to create a story where the setting itself is as much of a character as the people who inhabit it, such as with Frank Miller's Sin City. Whatever your motivation for going story first, here are a couple of tips you might want to consider. The first one is really about this entire topic, which is that neither the world first or story first approach is objectively better, neither in general nor in specific use cases. I have heard it said that planners do world first and pantsers do story first, and I sit here as a living counterexample because I'm about as much of a meticulous planner as you can get, and yet I still write story first because my books are about people above all else, and all the political and societal stuff is just a way to explore that. So if you go story first, one of the main things you want to focus on is that as you make up the world along with the story, you will want to prevent inconsistencies. The simplest way to do it is to keep a separate document as a fact sheet, and whenever mention something specific about the world, record it in there immediately. You can actually make this a spreadsheet as well, so that besides the individual facts, you can also list what they are related to, so you can make it more easily searchable later. Another technique you might want to consider is that even if you can't be bothered to draw a world map, it can still be useful to make a world graph. And I can give you an example from my first book to illustrate this. In my first novel, the countries mentioned in the story are Ardon, Salis, Midoriya, Weren, Brast, Larithia, and Kalim. Out of these, Ardon is where the story actually takes place, so I'll put that in the middle. And then the countries of Salis, Weren, Midoriya, and Brast are set to share a border with it, so those will need to be around it in some configuration. Now, this is not explicitly described in the story, but there are a couple of facts that I need to take into consideration. The first one is that Salus's climate is said to be warmer than Ardahn's, and because I grew up in the Northern Hemisphere, to me, warmer means south, so Salus will be to the south of Ardahn. Besides this, Ardahn is said to have a coast with the Grey Sea, and it is mentioned that Ardahn and Wern are frequently engaged in naval conflicts over the Grey Sea, so Wern will need to have a coastline as well. And then another fact that is mentioned is that Midoriya is often called in to mediate during these conflicts because it shares a border both with Ardahn and Wern, but it doesn't have a connection to the sea. Finally, Lyrithia and Kalim are mentioned to be neighboring countries overseas from Ardahn. So here's what the graph looks like after mapping out all these relationships, and here is what it looks like after tidying up and rearranging a little bit. It is nowhere close to being an actual world map, but as a reminder for myself of what is where, it's pretty helpful. Besides mapping out the relative position of countries, it can also be useful to decide their approximate size, at least for the countries that your characters will be traveling through, so that you can give semi-realistic or at least consistent time durations. And then once you have that, you can drill down into specific countries if you want and draw similar graphs about their interiors. For example, in Ardahn, I've decided that the capital of New Montrose is on the coast of the Grey Sea, so it's gonna be to the west, and it's close to the Werish border, so it'll be on the north. By contrast, the city of Calix is close to the Cilician border, so it's gonna be on the south, and the city of Tarnisha is in the Corny Mountains, which I put to the southwest. Now, this might all be well and good, but there is still one caveat about this, and that is the question of scope. Namely, is this going to be a standalone novel, or are you going to grow it into a series? When Sir Terry Pratchett started the Discworld series, he very clearly took a story-first approach because he famously said that there is no map of the Discworld because you can't map a sense of humor. And then he famously went back on that when he eventually released the canonical official map of the Discworld. So the thing is, if you just release a standalone novel, there's a lot you can get away with in terms of world building simply by banking on the assumption that your readers just aren't gonna ask that many questions. But then, if you proceed to grow it into a series, that comes with the added expectation that the world should be able to accommodate not just the individual stories, but all of them together on some timeline. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments, and until next time, stay tuned.